Hi, I'm Bruce Williams. Welcome to Chamber Chats. I am the CEO of the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce. That's why we call it Chamber Chats. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on the ancestral lands of the Lekwungen-speaking Coast Salish nations, the Esquimalt and the Songhees in particular. It's our privilege and honor to live and work alongside them every single day. Chamber Chats is brought to you by Island Savings, a division of First West Credit Union, and by C-SPAN Victoria Shipyards. And as always, we are recording in the studio of Czech Television. Do you have favorite brands? Are there things that you buy all the time, or stores that you go to, or services that you use because you like them? When I was a kid, I always remember there was a particular manufacturer of cars that my father always said, I'll never buy one of those. They're junk. You'll never catch me doing that. People's loyalties are driven by a lot of different things. We're going to talk about that today with us. It's an annual fascinating study done by the Gustavson School of Business every year. It's called the Brand Trust Index. Saul Klein is the dean of the Gustavson School. He joins us to talk about that. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Bruce. I'm doing great. It's great to be with you today.
This is such an amazing study. Like, when you take a look at it, you see the big names that we all know and which ones are valued and trusted and which ones raise in their trust and which ones go down. How do you gather this data, first of all? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so this is something we've been doing for the last 6 years. Each year, we've been expanding the number of brands that we've been studying. At the moment, it's almost 400. And these are national brands that most Canadians will be familiar with. What we do is a survey looking at people's perceptions of those brands. And this last year, we surveyed almost 9,000 people across the country, making sure that we have a representative sample across geographically representative gender, age, income. That's a pretty big data gathering exercise.
I mean, having trust is what any company, corporation, organization, you want to have trust. You want to have people who trust you. So year over year, there are some companies that raise up in the ratings and some that drop down in the ratings. We're going to get into specifics here in just a moment, but the ones that fell in the trust element, why did that happen for the most part, especially during COVID?
Yeah, well, COVID is really interesting because it forced us to rethink the priorities and look at how people are looking at the businesses they engage with quite differently. So maybe I'll give you a bit of context. And we look at trust as comprising three different elements. I mean, there's an overall trust, but then we look at, well, what's driving it? One of the elements is a very functional product-based element. So we trust organizations, we trust brands who are reliable, good value for money, high quality, innovative, very functional characteristics. The second element is more relational. So we trust brands based on how they relate to us as consumers. Do they communicate with us honestly? Do they respect our privacy? Do they fix problems when something goes on? So that's a relational thing. We refer to that as affinity, the extent to which people really like a brand based on its relationships. And then there's the third element, which is more of a function of the values that underline the brand. So it's not enough simply for a brand to be providing good products or good services. As consumers, we're also expecting them to do the right thing. So we look at elements like, do people perceive the brand as respecting and protecting the environment, as treating employees well, as contributing to the local community? And one thing we saw particularly strongly this last year is that those value-based elements have really come to the forefront. It's not to say that people are trading off, bad products and bad service for good values, but increasingly we're having higher expectations for brands. And during the pandemic, those value-based elements was certainly highlighted. So we saw brands that did particularly well on those elements increase in the rankings, and those who perhaps were a little bit tone deaf and didn't respond in ways that we thought were appropriate during the pandemic, they did drop.
So one of the roller coasters throughout COVID has been the case of Amazon. So Amazon is a company that people have loved or hated for a long time. I think some of that goes down to they identify with the character of Jeff Bezos and that he's got all of this wealth, yet there are things that many people feel he should be doing that he's not. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic that the owner is so front and center for the brand. But Amazon went up and down during COVID. Talk about that for a sec, if you would.
Yeah, really interesting. Amazon was one of those brands that during COVID we've used more and more. But ironically, it's one we seem to be trusting less and less. And we think there are a couple of things going on there. And Amazon as we've been using it more, has actually been declining for the last several years. We did expect that during the pandemic, it would get a bit of a bump. It didn't happen at all. And again, we think there's several things going on here, and they really relate to those value-based elements. So people aren't concerned about Amazon's ability to deliver function. They are concerned about prices. And there were a number of reports early in the pandemic when some products were scarce that there were concerns about price gouging, and often not so much Amazon themselves, but some of the third-party vendors had increased their prices significantly. And there was concerns about price gouging. And I think Amazon was some of that, although they seem to have addressed that pretty quickly. The more fundamental concerns, I think, are around Amazon as an organization. And two elements certainly come to the forefront. One is about how they treat their employees. And during the pandemic, we saw lots of media reports about Amazon workers, how well they were being protected in distribution centers from COVID, the working conditions. It also touches to some extent on one of the concerns we saw about the whole gig economy, where employees that are, or people that are working not on a regular employment basis are being seen to be some of the victims during COVID. So that's one element. The other element, I think, is a more interesting, bigger picture one, because it relates to what could happen coming out of the pandemic. And it's the impact that Amazon has had on business community more generally. We all talked about the Amazon effect, and many small retailers in particular, and in some cases very large retailers, have not been able to withstand the competitive pressure. And that's leading to a bit of a reshaping of the economy. And I think there is a concern that people have about this big behemoth, Amazon, potentially behaving monopolistically, but certainly the fact that it's having an impact on local retail environments, that the corner store is under enormous pressure. And we've seen significant restructuring in the retail sector as a consequence of Amazon's behavior.
As we at the Chamber like to remind people, whatever you're buying on Amazon, you can source locally, and chances are pretty good that you can have it delivered right to your door the same way you would if you delivered from Amazon. I want to talk about what happened with Tesla. That goes down as well to the character of the individual at the head of the company. But the question everybody wants to know, of course, is what I want to talk about next, and that is, who is number one in the Brand Trust Index? Talking today with Saul Klein, who's the Dean of the Gustavson School of Business, about the Brand Trust Index. So the list, Saul, I'm just going to say it right off the top. Mm-hmm. The strongest brand in Canada is the Canadian Automobile Association, which I guess would be the BCAA here. I find that quite fascinating. Number two, I have one of these in my house, Dyson, the guy with the super vacuums and the fans. Number three, I found this very entertaining, Lego is trusted because people with kids love that. And number four is one you mentioned earlier about who takes care of our security. Interac is number four and the most trusted. So that opens up a whole can of worms right there. In dealing with financial matters, we have to have trust in the brand of the products and the financial institutions that we deal with. So let's talk about that for a second, because a number of banks did show up pretty high on this list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and banks and financial institutions typically do quite well. And during the pandemic, we saw that increase quite significantly. A little bit of hesitation. We did two surveys last year, which was unusual for us. One in April, and then we followed up with our second survey in February and March of this year, because we wanted to see, was there an early effect from the pandemic, and contrast that with a year-on-year change. One of the things we saw in some of those financial brands is early in the pandemic, there was a little bit of concern, and particularly the transaction processes, Interac, MasterCard, Visa, they actually dropped a little bit. And I think people were worried about their own incomes, their financial stability, and how those brands would actually help them overcome the challenges. What we saw over the course of the year is those brands recovered significantly in trust and increased overall. And I think that's really a testament to their responsiveness to the financial pressures that Canadians were facing. And that's one of the ways where they really did a good job of building trust. They also were very outspoken and very active in trying to play a role in their communities, trying to ameliorate some of the negative consequences of the pandemic.
Yeah, people are terrified of money at the best of times, so they want to have some level of trust in whoever's managing or helping them better understand their money. The rest of the list of the top trusted brands: President's Choice, Costco. This is all national, by the way. President's Choice, Costco, Home Hardware, Mountain Equipment Co-op, which actually fell from the number one spot last year, and we'll talk about that in a second. Quaker Oats, Comfort Food, a company called Lactalis, which is a dairy company based in Eastern Canada, that went from the 70th position to the 10th.
Mm-hmm.
Canadian Tire, everybody's fave, Canadian Tire for sure, and Indigo Chapters are the others that are at the top of the list here. So I want to talk about MEC, Mountain Equipment Co-op. They and Tim Hortons took a bit of a hit this year because they sold out to American companies. Let's talk about that when it comes to brand.
For sure. And we've seen, I mean, Tim Hortons was sold a number of years ago, and we've seen their brand scores actually plummet. When we first did the study 6 years ago, Tim Hortons was the most trusted brand in Canada. And we've seen a fairly consistent decline. Now, part of that, I think, is attributable to new ownership, but it's also what the new owners do that matters. And for Tim's, I think there was a particular focus on short-term profitability, on trying to maximize the financial value of the brand. And part of the consequence was they lost some of the relationship they've had with their franchisees and that retail environment. I mean, Tim's was always known for supporting the local soccer team, for contributing a lot to the community. And they took a real hit a number of years ago. And this was soon after the acquisition, when the minimum wage was increased. And Tim's, the franchisor, essentially forced the franchisees to absorb some of the increased labor costs. And that didn't go down well at all. So in terms of that, those values about treating people fairly and being part of the community took a hit. Over time, we've seen Tim's kind of jump around a bit. Something happens, they drop a bit, positive developments, they increase. So there's a bit of volatility there. MEC I think is a different story. It's a little bit too early to tell. We did not see a major drop in trust this year, but what we did see is quite a significant drop in what we call customer advocacy, the extent to which consumers recommend a brand to others. It was a brand that we followed quite closely because we thought that it could be an effect, because once the acquisition was announced, there was a lot of pushback from MEC members. So remember, it's a co-op. It was a co-op. And many of the members expressed deep concern about the way in which the organization had been taken over. That didn't translate, say, that directly into a loss of trust. And I think it's because the new owners have been pretty good about signaling that MEC, in terms of its value proposition to customers, is not changing. The kind of things that consumers would expect from MEC in terms of product knowledge, also in terms of sustainability in their practices, are things that the new owners are indicating that they will continue to support. So it didn't have as much of an impact as we thought it would.
This whole report, of course, is available online through the Gustavson School website or the UVic website, Chamber Champion UVic. Auto rental companies, the most trusted brand is Enterprise. In beverages, it's Canada Dry. Would have thought it would be Coke or Pepsi, but no, it's Canada Dry. Health and beauty, Shoppers Drug Mart. Hotels, Fairmont. This is one, though, the takeout restaurant one. This one, I think, Saul, goes down to marketing. And I want to ask you about the marketing and the role of this. The favorite takeout restaurant is A&W. And that, I think, if marketing is involved, is based on that guy who does the TV commercials, who's so natural. And so how much of this brand recognition and trust is based in what the marketing strategy is for these companies?
Well, the marketing strategy certainly helps, but it can only go so far if the brand isn't actually living up to the messages that are being communicated. So ultimately, it has to go hand in hand. We've got some brands that there's a high degree of familiarity, very high degree of awareness, but are not trusted. And the reverse holds true as well. We've got some brands that are actually very trusted, but awareness seems to be low, and there's not a lot of advocacy for them. So, for the brand owner, it's really about managing both of those elements, making sure that you're getting the message out in a positive way, but also being authentic at the same time. There's a real risk that, if you go out with, positive messages designed to build trust, And if the customer experience that's behind it doesn't match, then you're actually worse off than you were before. So, I don't think it's just that we can simply put out messages and people are going to accept them. It really is about holding the feet to the fire, and are we actually delivering on those messages that we're promising?
Yeah. All of us know stories that maybe we've done ourselves where we say, well, I hate that phone company. I'm going to go to that one. We find out, well, they're no better than the other guys, so I'm going to try and. So at some point, everybody's had some frustration with the telcos. We're going to tell you next who the most trusted brand among those is. Again, we're talking today with Saul Klein, the Dean of the Gustavson School of Business, about the Brand Trust Index. We want to put a local optic on this in a second here, but Saul, among the national people that are the telcos or the phone companies, if you will, there's Bell, there's Rogers, there's Shaw, there's Telus. Yep. And on a national scale, the one that's the most trusted brand is Telus, which is actually a Western-based company. I find that kind of fascinating.
Yeah. Well, let me also comment, there's another effect going on here, in that the level of trust varies significantly across categories. Car rental and telcos are actually some of the least trusted categories overall, whereas dairy and hotels tend to be very high trust categories. So for us, it's really interesting to look within the category, recognizing that they're all suffering from the same broader perceptions. How does a particular brand stand out? And Telus has done an amazing job of differentiating themselves from the other telcos in terms of those value-based elements. I think we often get frustrated by telcos' pricing practices. There's certainly a history where politicians have used telcos as political footballs, as to, maybe it's an easy way to buy some support, is to bash the telcos. But I think it is a matter of looking at what are they doing. And Telus has been very strong in building its relationships with its customers. It has lower turnover rates or higher loyalty with its customers. And they play a big role in the communities. So think about Telus's community partnerships, where they play a major role in trying to help out. Telus has also been interesting in that they've been expanding into other sectors, and some of them I think might have benefited from them. So Telus Health, for example, while health was very much top of mind during the pandemic, having access to telemedicine when you might not have been able to go see a doctor is one of those ways that an organization can really build trust.
Yeah, the most trusted brand for transportation is something that, again, indicates this is a national survey, excuse me, because the most trusted brand for transportation is Via Rail. We don't have any trains on Vancouver Island, but there is a bit of a local optic to this too, right? Like you might say that, well, Thrifty Foods is a trusted brand, or Monroe's Books, or Fairway Market, or Red Barn. So give me a little perspective on the local side of this.
Yeah, so our major studies, so the 393 brands we measure, have to be national. So they have to be operating in at least two or three regions. Beyond that, we actually do measure about a dozen regional brands that don't actually have a strong presence, but that we're particularly interested in following. Because one of the interesting characteristics is we seem to trust regional brands more than national brands. And we actually, this is an interesting Canadian phenomenon, seem to trust national brands more than global brands. Now, at the local level, if we look at BC, we've got some really trusted brands. Let me point to two. One of them has done very well over the last couple of years. It's actually been on an upward trajectory for the last 5 or 6 years, and that was reinforced during the pandemic, and that's London Drugs.
Right.
So as a brand, not only is it seen as being meeting all of the functional characteristics and delivering on the customer relationship piece, but they're also be seen as playing a positive role in society. So I thought one of the interesting things we observed from London Drugs was making shelf space available for local producers to be able to give them access to market. So that's one that's really strong. The other one that that regularly does very well, particularly on the value-based dimension, is Vancity. Vancity has clearly been able to differentiate itself from other financial institutions. I think it does reflect some of the co-op ethos that it has in its members, but it goes beyond that in terms of the extent to which they're seen as playing a very positive role in society and are trying to make the world a better place. And if anything, those elements during a pandemic became much more important.
Well, yeah, within this index, too, it indicates that the amount of time that we've spent eating at home meant that our trust in a lot of food products went up. People like Kellogg's, Campbell Soup, General Mills, Kraft, Maple Leaf, McCain all saw higher recognition. What's the age factor in this? Younger people, I think younger generations always have less trust in big name companies and things. It's the nature of it, right? And this indicates the same thing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You refer to two elements here. Yeah, during the pandemic, we did see a bump in trust with the familiar brands. Yeah, Quaker Oats, Kellogg's, and I think there was so much change happening around us that when we did have familiar brands that there was a long longevity to, I think we kind of looked for that. It wasn't a time when we wanted to be more adventurous. We're being pushed out of our comfort zones anyway. So that's one piece. The other piece you're raising is really interesting in that we do see that younger consumers are more cynical. They're more skeptical about brands across the board. And at one level, it was a little bit counterintuitive. When we first saw this, it was a number of years ago, we thought that, well, maybe it's going to be the older consumers who are getting a bit cynical, more jaded, but that's not the case. Younger consumers, and our thinking is that it has a lot to do with their expectations around the societal impacts. And certainly we see it within our students, we see it more broadly in society, where younger consumers, and maybe it's a generational change, are expecting more, they're demanding more from the organizations they do business with. They want them to be seen, they want to see them as doing the right thing, as making a more positive impact. They don't want to be supporting with their purchases brands that don't align with their own values. So we also see differences across ages in terms of brands that are most trusted. So the most trusted brand amongst our younger population, and this is all above 18, is Patagonia.
Patagonia, yeah.
And if you think about not only the outdoor image, but the whole issue of sustainability and social responsibility that comes through so strongly in the case of Patagonia, resonates particularly well with younger consumers.
Yeah, we unfortunately are out of time. We didn't get a chance to talk about Tesla, but I think people are getting kind of tired of Elon Musk. That could be part of it, but it's a really fascinating study to take a look at this. It's the Brand Trust Index through the Gustavson School of Business at UVic, a chamber champion, UVic. Saul Klein is the dean of the Gustavson School. I would encourage all folks to go online and take a look at this, Saul. It's fascinating reading. Thanks for your time, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Bruce. It's my pleasure. Anytime.
We'll see you next time around for another Chamber Chat.
For more episodes of Chamber Chats, go to checknews.ca/podcasts.